My name is Delilah Reeves, and I am 69 years old. For most of my life, I served as the director of the Reeves Family Foundation, a charity that provided housing grants and scholarships across the Midwest. People used to call me the heart of the Reeves legacy. Yet on the morning that changed everything, I felt anything but powerful. I was simply a mother visiting her son's grave at our private family cemetery, the one reserved only for direct blood relatives, when I saw a poor woman with a little boy who had a strangely familiar smile. She looked afraid, pulling him back as if I were a threat. Then the boy whispered one word to the gravestone that revealed a secret that changed our lives in ways I never imagined. It was a cold Sunday morning, the kind where the air feels thin and crisp, and the grass is still wet with dew. Our family cemetery sits behind the old Reeves estate, surrounded by iron fencing and tall oak trees that have stood longer than any of us. I have walked that path hundreds of times since my son Evan passed away 4 years ago. Each visit felt like reopening a wound that never fully healed. The silence there always seemed too heavy, too final, as if the world had decided to move on without me. I brought fresh flowers, as I always did, white lilies that Evan loved when he was a boy. I had just placed them by his headstone when I heard something I had not heard in that place for years. Laughter. Light, innocent laughter that carried through the chilly air and settled directly in my chest. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Grief does that. It makes ghosts out of memories. But when I turned, I saw them. A young woman was sitting on a thin blanket spread across the grass near Evan's gravestone. Her coat looked worn and faded, her jeans were frayed at the knees, and the soles of her shoes were nearly detached. Beside her sat a little boy, no older than 4, holding a caramel-colored teddy bear with patches of fabric missing. The bear's fur was matted, but the child held it with such tenderness that it looked priceless. When the boy turned his face toward me, I froze. His smile. It was the same crooked, dimpled smile Evan had from the time he learned how to grin. The same brightness in the eyes, the same warmth. My heart stumbled, and for a moment it felt like Evan was standing in front of me again, that familiar spark flickering back to life. The woman noticed me staring and immediately tightened her grip on the boy's shoulders. Her posture changed, tense and guarded, like an animal ready to flee. Fear flashed across her eyes, and she pulled the boy closer as if she expected me to shout at them or chase them away. Her reaction made no sense. I had never seen her before. Yet she looked at me as if she knew exactly who I was. Before I could speak, the boy turned back toward Evan's gravestone. He lowered his head, placed his small hand gently against the cold marble, and whispered one word, "Daddy." The sound of it ripped through me. My breath caught in my throat, and my body felt rooted to the ground. I stared at the child, searching his face for any hint that I had misheard. But the word hung in the air, undeniable. In his hands, he clutched a teddy bear I recognized instantly. I had given that exact bear to Evan when he was 5 years old. He used to drag it around the house until the seams stretched. I had sewn the ear back on myself one summer evening. He refused to sleep without it. My pulse was hammered, my thoughts blurred. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but my voice would not form a single word. The woman hurriedly began gathering their things. Her hands trembled. She stuffed the blanket into a torn backpack and tugged the boy to his feet. "Eli, we have to go," she said, her voice low but urgent. Eli. My knees weakened. That was the name Evan once told me he would give his son if he ever had one. He had said it with such certainty one evening on the porch, laughing as the sun set behind the trees. At the time, it felt like a dream for a distant future. I never believed he would have the chance. Yet here stood a little boy with his smile, his eyes, his teddy bear, and the name he had chosen. In that moment, everything clicked into place with chilling clarity. My son had left behind something no one ever told me about. A life, a child, a truth buried deeper than his body. As the woman hurried toward the gate, she looked back once. Fear, sorrow, and something like guilt flickered across her face. Then she disappeared through the trees, leaving me alone with the unbearable silence and a storm building inside my chest. My world shifted that morning. The grief I thought I understood became something entirely different. It was no longer just a loss. It was betrayal, secrecy, and a mystery that demanded answers. If you are still here with me, I would love for you to stay as the story unfolds. Feel free to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you will not miss what comes next. Your support helps our small storytelling community grow and give space for stories that heal. Because from that moment onward, nothing in my life stayed the same. My return to the story continues seamlessly from the moment everything changed. When I returned to the Reeves estate that afternoon, the air felt heavier than it had at the cemetery. The mansion stood tall and immaculate, but it no longer felt like mine. After Evan passed, my younger son, Marcus Reeves, took over the household, the finances, and the company that had been in our family for generations. I used to walk through those marble hallways with purpose. Now I moved quietly, like a guest who stayed too long. The staff greeted me politely, yet their eyes flicked toward Marcus before offering help, as though permission belonged to him. My footsteps echoed against the polished floor, reminding me that grief had rearranged the balance of everything, even within my own home. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the study, dressed in a tailored suit, holding a stack of documents. His expression carried the same restraint he used at company board meetings, polite on the surface, yet firm underneath. He asked how my visit to the cemetery had been, but the question sounded mechanical, like a formality he had been trained to perform. I told him it was quiet, which was not true, and his eyebrow twitched with mild impatience. He mentioned new expenses, charitable audits, and property management concerns, though I no longer served in any official capacity. Then he shifted the conversation toward me, asking how I felt living in a house that required so much upkeep, hinting that a senior living community might offer convenience and security. He said it gently, but the message pierced me. He saw me as fragile and burdensome. I listened without interrupting, letting his words settle like dust. In my youth, I was decisive and unwavering, but grief had softened my speech and slowed my responses. Marcus interpreted my quiet as weakness. He spoke about schedules, medical checkups, transportation, and liability. He framed it as concern, yet his tone held calculation. He did not ask what I wanted. He assumed. I nodded politely and thanked him, though inside my chest a slow ache formed, one that felt different from mourning. It felt like displacement, like becoming a relic preserved out of obligation rather than love. When he excused himself to join a conference call, I stayed in the study and let my hands rest on the armrests of the leather chair. I remembered sitting there with Evan discussing future projects and community plans. The room felt colder without him. I needed air, so I stepped outside and walked back toward the path that led to the cemetery. The groundskeeper, Harvey Cole, was locking the side gate when I arrived. Harvey was 72, wiry and steady, a man who had tended the graves for decades. He looked at me with eyes that had witnessed more farewells than most ministers. He asked if I had found peace during my visit. I hesitated before answering. The image of the little boy whispering to Evan's gravestone flashed in my mind, stirring a tremor I could not hide. Harvey tilted his head, noticing. Then he said something that struck me deeper than Marcus's polite dismissal. He said the boy spoke to the grave as though his father were still alive, while I had come to the cemetery as though I were speaking to an empty space. His words lingered in the cool air, settling into the spaces grief had hollowed out. I felt a flicker of shame, not because I had mourned incorrectly, but because I had never considered that Evan might have left more behind than memories. The woman's frightened expression replayed in my thoughts. Why had she pulled the boy away so quickly? Why did she look at me with fear rather than curiosity? What had she been told about me, about the family, about the legacy that Marcus guarded so tightly? I walked slowly back toward the house, my pulse unsteady, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath me. For the first time since Evan's death, my grief took on a new shape. It was no longer just sorrow. It was suspicion, faint but growing, like a quiet drumbeat in the background of my mind. I paused at the threshold of the mansion, looking at the ornate doors that once welcomed family celebrations. Now they felt symbolic, as if they marked the boundary between what I had believed and what I was beginning to question. Marcus's voice carried faintly from inside, confident and authoritative as he spoke on his call. I realized how seamlessly he had stepped into control after Evan's passing, how easily everyone accepted it, and how quietly I had faded into the background. The image of the little boy's smile returned again, warm and familiar, refusing to let me dismiss it. Something inside me stirred, steady and resolute. I knew I had to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. The questions that had begun to form inside me did not fade overnight. They grew stronger with each hour, pushing me toward action rather than quiet contemplation. The morning after my conversation with Harvey, I sat at the small writing desk in my bedroom and opened my old address book. Grief had made me passive for years, but something about that little boy had reawakened the part of me that once led a foundation and negotiated with city officials. I knew I needed answers, and I knew I could not rely on Marcus or anyone connected to the family business. So I contacted someone outside their reach. Her name was Linda Porter. She was a retired police detective who had worked on missing persons and fraud cases. I had hired her once before to help a scholarship recipient who was being exploited by a landlord. Linda was steady, discreet, and loyal to truth rather than influence. When she answered the phone, her voice carried the same calm authority I remembered. I told her I needed information about a young woman and a child, and that the matter was delicate. She agreed to meet that afternoon. Linda arrived through the side entrance to avoid attention. She wore a simple blazer and carried a leather folder. Her eyes scanned the estate with familiar sharpness. We sat in the garden room where the light was soft and the staff rarely entered without invitation. I described the woman at the cemetery, the fear in her eyes, and the boy named Eli. Linda listened without interrupting, taking notes with precision. She asked for details I had not realized I remembered, like the frayed stitching on the boy's bear and the accent in the woman's voice. Then she nodded thoughtfully and said she would begin with public housing records, student registries, and hospital archives. She promised to return within 48 hours. Her confidence steadied me. For the first time since Evan died, I felt movement rather than stagnation. 2 days. Later, Linda returned with findings that made my pulse quicken. She placed a slim file on the table and began reading from her notes. The woman's name was Rosa Delgado. She was 31 years old. She had once been an architecture student at a local university, known for strong design work and high grades. She had withdrawn from school suddenly 4 years ago, within weeks of Evan's death. There were records of her being evicted from her apartment shortly after, with no listed employment. The timing aligned too perfectly to ignore. Linda continued, explaining that someone had accessed Rosa's hospital file the same day Evan died. The access was unauthorized and traced to a device associated with the Reeves corporate network. My chest tightened. I asked what that implied. Linda said it suggested someone with power and resources had wanted information about Rosa, and had done so covertly. Then Linda paused before sharing what she called the part that would stir controversy if it ever reached public ears. She said there had been rumors circulating within the corporate offices. Staff had whispered that Evan had fathered a child with a Latina woman, and that the family wanted the matter hidden to protect reputation and shareholder confidence. The implication hit me like a cold wave. Not only had a child potentially been concealed, but the erasure had been wrapped in prejudice and power. The thought disgusted me. It also ignited something fierce and protective within me, a fire I thought grief had extinguished. Linda said the rumor had been dismissed publicly, but privately it had circulated for months after Evan's death. The idea that my son's legacy had been twisted into a scandalous secret made my hands tremble. The racial undertone of the rumor sickened me even more. I thanked Linda and asked her to continue digging, especially for proof of who accessed the hospital file. As Linda gathered her papers, we heard footsteps in the hallway. The door opened and Marcus stepped inside without knocking. His eyes flicked from me to the folder on the table, and suspicion sharpened his expression. He asked what we were discussing. I replied calmly that I had hired Linda to look into something personal. Marcus did not hide his irritation. He asked why I would waste money on a private investigator when the family had internal resources. His tone hardened further when I mentioned the woman at the cemetery. His jaw tightened, and he demanded to know whether I intended to embarrass the family. Then he said something that revealed more than he meant to. He asked if I planned to let a gold digger destroy the Reeves name. The venom in his voice made the room feel smaller. I remained silent, choosing not to defend myself or argue. Silence has a way of unsettling those who expect compliance. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, waiting for me to retreat as I had so many times since Evan died. When I did not, he turned abruptly and left the room, his footsteps sharp against the floor. Linda watched him go, then looked back at me with steady eyes. She asked whether I still wanted to proceed. I nodded. In that moment, my resolve solidified. The truth mattered more than reputation, more than comfort, more than keeping peace within a house that no longer felt like home. The decision to seek out Rosa on my own came quietly, like a thought that refused to dissolve. I waited until Marcus left for a business dinner, then took my coat, a scarf, and the address Linda had circled in neat handwriting. I drove without telling the driver, choosing instead to take my old sedan that had not been used in months. The city looked different when you were not shielded by tinted windows and planned routes. I passed neighborhoods I had once visited for charity events, yet this time I was not there to give speeches or shake hands. I was a mother chasing the ghost of a truth that had been kept from her. The closer I came to the address, the narrower the streets became. Streetlights flickered. Laundry hung from rusted balconies. The building where Rosa lived was made of cracking brick and peeling paint. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete, old cooking oil, and something metallic. The hallway light buzzed overhead, casting uneven shadows on the floor. I could hear a television from one apartment and arguing from another. The door numbers were crooked and scratched, some handwritten on masking tape. I found the unit Linda had listed and hesitated before knocking. The door's lock looked rusted, and when I pressed my knuckles against the wood, the sound was dull. There was a rustle inside, then a scraping sound as the lock struggled to turn. The door opened only halfway, chained from the inside. Rosa stood there, her face pale with shock. She wore a stretched sweater and jeans that looked too thin for the cold. Her hair was tied back hastily. Her eyes widened as though she were seeing a ghost. She asked how I had found her, her voice cracking with fear rather than anger. I told her calmly that I had asked someone to help me locate her and that I only wanted to talk. She tried to close the door, but the chain caught and rattled. I did not push. I simply stood still, letting her see that my hands were empty and my posture unthreatening. After a moment, she removed the chain and opened the door fully, though her body remained tense. The apartment was small, with a kitchenette barely separated from the living space. The air smelled of reheated food and cleaning chemicals. A portable heater hummed in the corner. I stepped inside slowly, waiting for her to signal that I was allowed to stand where I stood. Before either of us could speak, a soft thud came from the bedroom. Then Eli appeared, clutching the caramel-colored teddy bear to his chest. He ran toward the living room with the excited energy of a child, but he stopped when he saw me. His breathing sounded tight and wheezing, as though each inhale required effort. I recognized the signs of asthma from years spent caring for Evan as a boy. The memory made my heart twist. Eli leaned against his mother, pressing his cheek into her hip, while still staring at me with wide, curious eyes. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of his eyelashes, the slope of his nose, the way his small fingers curled around the bear. My chest ached with recognition. Rosa lifted him gently and told him to stay in the bedroom, but he resisted, insisting on staying close enough to watch. She finally set him down on the worn sofa with an inhaler beside him. Then she turned back to me, her voice sharp with panic. She demanded to know what I wanted. I told her I did not come to take anything from her. I said I only wanted to know the truth. My voice remained calm, steady, and low. Her eyes filled with anger, fear, and exhaustion. She said there was no truth I needed to know. She said her life had been difficult enough without the Reeves family finding her. She accused me of trying to control her, of wanting to erase her and her child. I listened, letting the storm of her words pass through the room. When she paused, I repeated that I wanted nothing she had. All I wanted was to understand. She shook her head and pointed toward the door, telling me to leave. She said she did not trust wealthy families, especially mine. She said the Reeves name had already taken too much from her. I stood still, feeling the weight of her history pressing against the space between us. I prepared to step back, willing to leave rather than escalate her fear. But then Eli spoke. His voice was soft and uncertain. He asked one word, "Grandma." The sound of it cracked something inside me. It felt like hearing Evan again, small and innocent, reaching for comfort. Rosa reacted instantly. She snatched him close, her hand gripping his arm protectively. She whispered sharply that he must never call me that. Her voice shook with something deeper than anger. It was fear shaped by memory. Eli looked confused, his brows furrowing, but he obeyed, lowering his gaze. I stood rooted, unable to speak. The word hung in the air, fuller than a confession. Rosa turned her back to me, shielding the child. Her posture said everything she would not say out loud. Someone had taught her to fear us. Someone had convinced her that being connected to us was dangerous. I stepped toward the door slowly, not wanting to frighten them further. Before leaving, I told her that I would not force anything. I said that if she ever wanted to talk, I would listen. Then I stepped back into the dim hallway, hearing the lock slide into place behind me. The cold air outside felt different this time. It carried not just mystery, but urgency. I knew then that whatever truth lay ahead would not be simple or gentle. When I woke the next morning, I could not shake the image of Eli's confused eyes or the way Rosa had clutched him, as if the world were trying to steal him away. I spent hours pacing my room, torn between respecting her fear and needing to understand what had bound her life to Evan so completely. By late afternoon, I found myself driving back toward the same building. I did not call ahead. I simply followed the pull inside me, the one that told me the past was finally demanding to be heard. When I reached her door, I knocked softly. This time she opened it without the chain, though caution filled every line of her face. She asked why I had returned. I told her I could not walk away without saying one thing. The words rose from a place deeper than logic. I asked her whether Evan had loved her. The question hung between us like a held breath. Her eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth as though she had been struck. Then her composure crumbled, and she began to cry. Not the quiet tears of someone embarrassed by emotion, but the raw sobs of a woman who had been holding too much for too long. She sank onto the sofa, and I sat across from her, giving her space. Eli was not in the room, and I was grateful for that. When she finally spoke, her voice shook with memory. She said Evan had wanted to go public about their relationship. He had talked about introducing her, about refusing to hide, about choosing honesty over image. She said he had told her she made him feel like a real person, rather than a symbol of legacy. Then her voice hardened as she said pressure from the company and from unnamed voices within the family had weighed on him. He had been torn between love and obligation. She said he had promised her that once a financial audit was completed, he would no longer allow anyone to dictate his life. Hearing that made my stomach tighten. Evan had never told me about any of this. I wondered whether he had wanted to protect me or whether he had feared I would choose the company over him. Rosa wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. She said the night before he died, he came to her door. He looked shaken and tired. He told her he had discovered that someone within the family was embezzling funds from the company, siphoning money quietly through shell accounts. He said he had evidence and intended to confront the board. He also said that if anything happened to him, she should not trust Marcus. The words hit me like a blow. Hearing my son's voice echoed through hers was like opening a sealed wound. I asked whether she understood why he had singled out Marcus. She said Evan did not explain, only that Marcus had been growing more controlling and erratic behind the scenes. She said Evan told her to keep herself and the baby hidden until he could expose the truth. Then she said he kissed her and left, promising to return the next day. He never did. I sat silently, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. My mind raced through memories I had buried. The strained conversations between Evan and Marcus, the arguments I dismissed as normal sibling rivalry, the subtle shifts in company reports that I blamed on market as changes. I felt shame spread through me, thick and heavy. I asked Rosa why she had not come forward after his death. Her expression darkened. She said someone from the company approached her. They told her Evan's death was being treated as an accident and implied that she would be blamed if she caused trouble. They said the Reeves family would never acknowledge her or the child. They warned that the press would tear her apart. She said she believed them because she was alone and vulnerable, and because she feared for her baby. I asked whether Marcus had been involved in that intimidation. She said she never saw him, but the person who contacted her used language that sounded like him. Calculated, cold, final. I felt my heart pounding, not with grief this time, but with something sharper. Betrayal, yes, but also awakening. I realized how easily power can rewrite truth, how silence can erase entire lives. I looked at Rosa and saw not an intruder, but a young woman who had carried danger, love, and survival on her shoulders. I wanted to apologize for every moment she had lived in fear because of the name I bore, but the words refused to form. Instead, I placed my hand on the edge of the table between us, steady and open. I told her that I believed her. She looked at me with disbelief, searching my face for judgment. When she found none, her shoulders slumped with relief and exhaustion. I remained quiet, though inside my spirit surged with a new and frightening clarity. If Evan had uncovered wrongdoing and died before revealing it, someone had benefited from his silence. Someone had ensured the truth stayed buried. I stood and told Rosa I would not abandon her. She nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. When I stepped out into the fading light, I felt the world tilt. The past I thought I understood had fractured. The path ahead was no longer one of mourning, but of reckoning. Bringing Rosa and Eli into my protection did not feel like a choice. It felt like the only path that honored what I had learned and what Evan had wanted before his life was cut short. The morning after she revealed the truth, I returned to her apartment with blankets, warm coats, and a calm determination. She hesitated when she opened the door, her eyes still wary, but Eli peeked from behind her holding the caramel bear, and something in her expression softened. I told her the guest house on the estate was private, safe, and warm. I said she would not owe me anything. She looked toward the peeling walls and the flickering ceiling bulb, then toward her son, whose breathing was still tight from asthma. Slowly, she nodded. Together, we packed their few belongings into 2 worn bags. The building's hallway felt less oppressive this time, though the scent of old cooking oil lingered. I helped Eli down the stairs, steadying him when his breath came shallow. When we reached the car, he climbed in and pressed his face to the window, watching the city fall away as we drove. When we arrived at the estate, I led them through the side garden toward the guest house, a charming cottage that once housed visiting artists during summer events. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and fresh linens. Sunlight filtered through clean windows, and the small kitchen gleamed. Rosa stood in the doorway, overwhelmed. Eli walked through the living room and touched the smooth wooden banister with wide eyes. I showed them where the heater controls were and where extra blankets were stored. I told her the pantry had been stocked and that a doctor who specialized in pediatric asthma would visit discreetly. She whispered thank you, but her voice carried both gratitude and disbelief. I told her to rest and settle in. As I stepped outside, I felt something I had not felt in years: purpose. By evening, the consequences arrived. The staff had seen a young woman and a child enter the grounds, and word traveled faster than any official announcement. Someone snapped a photo through the gate, and within hours, the internet spun its own narrative. Headlines began to appear on gossip sites claiming a single mother had moved into the Reeves estate. Comments exploded with speculation about inheritance, scandal, and opportunism. Some accused Rosa of trapping a wealthy family. Others suggested I had grown senile and been manipulated. A tabloid article declared that a mysterious woman and child were living off a billionaire legacy, implying scandal behind closed doors. The story spread with cruel fascination, feeding on stereotypes and bias. I read none of it directly, but the whispers from staff and the stiff politeness from the household told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, Rosa showed me her phone, trembling. Dozens of messages from strangers called her names, her eyes filled with humiliation and fear. I told her firmly that none of it mattered and that she and Eli were safe. She asked whether she should leave before things got worse. I told her that leaving would only confirm the lies others were eager to believe. She nodded slowly, absorbing the steadiness in my voice. Eli sat at the breakfast table with warm oatmeal and inhaled the steam, breathing easier than he had in the cramped apartment. The sight of his calm expression strengthened my resolve. Not long after, Marcus arrived. I heard his footsteps before he appeared, sharp and fast across the tile floor. He entered the garden where I was pruning roses and demanded an explanation. His face was flushed with anger, his voice controlled but cutting. He said photographers were calling the estate. He said investors had contacted him. Then he said I was destroying the family reputation. He asked how I could allow a stranger to live on the property. I stood slowly, wiped soil from my gloves, and faced him without blinking. He searched my expression for apology, for confusion, for surrender. I offered none. He repeated that the Reeves name was being dragged through the scene. Mud. I replied with 8 steady words. The girl and the child will stay here. The silence that followed was thick and electric. Marcus stared at me, startled by the firmness in my voice. He asked whether I understood the consequences. I did not answer. Silence can speak louder than outrage. He looked toward the guest house, then back at me, his jaw tightening with frustration he could not conceal. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. I listened to his departure without regret. When I returned to the guest house, Eli ran to show me a drawing he had made with crayons from the art supplies I had placed in a drawer. The picture showed 3 figures holding hands under a bright sun. Rosa watched from the doorway with eyes that glimmered, not with fear this time, but with something gentler. I placed the drawing on the small refrigerator door and told him it was perfect. As I stepped outside into the cool air, I realized that the storm around us was only beginning. Yet beneath the noise, a quiet truth took root. Silence no longer meant surrender. It meant strength gathering itself for what would come next. The morning after Marcus confronted me, the estate felt unusually still, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the next disruption. I decided to spend time with Rosa and Eli in the garden to ease their nerves. The sun was warm enough for us to sit outside, and Eli clutched his teddy bear as he walked beside me, his breathing steady for the moment. The guest house opened toward the back lawn, where the pool shimmered in the light. I reminded myself that the latch on the pool gate had recently been replaced. Marcus had ordered maintenance workers to upgrade it, claiming it was for safety. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I believed he was trying to prove responsibility. I now saw everything differently. Rosa spread a blanket under a tree and set out crayons for Eli. I stood nearby, trimming a potted herb, listening to the gentle rhythm of their voices. The peaceful moment shattered when I heard the sudden metallic click of the pool gate. I looked up and saw Eli standing at the edge of the pool, the gate wide open behind him. His small foot slipped on the wet tile, and the teddy bear fell into the water. His arms flailed as he tried to catch his balance. I ran faster than I believed my body still could, reaching him just as he tipped forward. I grabbed him around the waist and pulled him back, holding him tightly against my chest. His breath came in sharp, wheezing bursts. Rosa reached us, her face pale with terror, and pressed the inhaler to his lips. Eli clung to her, shaking. My heart pounded as I stared at the open gate. The latch was hanging loose, barely attached. I tested it, and it clicked halfway before slipping again. No safety lock, no resistance, nothing to prevent a child from entering. Rage and dread surged through me. I turned when I heard footsteps behind us. Harvey stood a few yards away, holding pruning shears. His expression was grave. He said he had noticed the workers earlier in the week. He said the latch they installed was not a safety model. He spoke calmly, but his eyes told me he understood the implications. I thanked him and carried Eli back to the blanket while Rosa held him and whispered soothing words. His breathing slowly steadied. After they were settled, I walked to the maintenance logs kept in the storage room. Marcus's signature authorized the replacement. The note said the upgrade was for child safety. The contradiction made my skin crawl. I stepped outside and looked toward the guest house. The pattern began to form in my mind. First, the unauthorized access to Rosa's hospital file. Then the rumors about a Latina woman being hidden to protect the family image. Then the tabloids publishing stories meant to shame her. Now a faulty latch that could have killed a child. The sequence was too precise to be coincidence. As I carried tea back to Rosa, I glanced at my phone. News alerts buzzed across the screen. Social media accounts were speculating again, claiming Rosa was exploiting the Reeves fortune. One headline showed a blurred photo of her entering the estate. Another accused me of losing my judgment in old age. The comments were cruel. Strangers argued viciously about her ethnicity, her clothing, and her worth. The bias was open and venomous. I turned off the screen, unwilling to feed the fire with attention. That afternoon, the estate intercom buzzed. A staff member announced that Child Protective Services had arrived at the gate. Rosa froze, her face draining of color. Eli clung to her shirt, sensing her fear. I told the staff to escort the agents to the garden. 2 caseworkers approached, carrying clipboards. They asked whether a child lived on the property. I said yes. They asked whether the living conditions were safe. I gestured toward the immaculate guest house, the stocked pantry, and the medical equipment the doctor had provided. They asked whether Rosa was being financially controlled. She shook her head, still trembling. Then one of them asked how long she had been living with me. The wording stung. It implied dependency, impropriety, and suspicion. I answered calmly, saying I had invited her and that she was free to leave at any time. They inspected the pool area. I pointed to the latch and explained the malfunction. The younger caseworker frowned and made notes. When they left, Rosa collapsed onto a chair, shaking. She asked why they had come. I told her someone had reported her. She looked toward the mansion, her expression tight with fear and anger. I could not deny the obvious. Marcus had both motive and access. He had wanted her gone from the beginning. As the sun set, I sat alone on the patio, replaying each event in my mind. The unauthorized hospital file, the whispered rumors meant to erase her legitimacy, the tabloid articles spread public shame, the defective latch was installed under the guise of safety, the sudden arrival of Child Protective Services. Each incident aligned with the moment Rosa entered my life. Each one carried the fingerprints of someone who viewed control as entitlement and truth as a threat. I felt a shift inside me, quiet but profound. This was no longer about grief. It was about protection, justice, and the unraveling of a lie that had been allowed to stand for far too long. When I returned to the guest house to say goodnight, Eli handed me a small drawing. It showed a pool with a broken gate and 3 figures standing safely away from the water. He smiled shyly, unaware of the weight the picture carried. I placed my hand gently on his hair and told him he was safe. As I stepped back into the night air, I understood that safety was no longer something to assume. It was something I would have to fight for. The visit from Child Protective Services should have ended the matter, but instead it marked the beginning of a deeper intrusion. 2 days later, they returned without warning. I was in the garden trimming rosemary when the intercom crackled and a staff member announced that CPS agents were requesting immediate entry. Rosa was in the guest house preparing lunch. And Eli was drawing by the window. When the knock sounded sharp and official, Rosa startled and dropped a plate. It shattered against the floor and Eli covered his ears, his breathing turning shallow. I opened the door before she could. The same 2 agents stood there, clipboards in hand, faces tight with scrutiny rather than neutrality. I invited them inside with a controlled steadiness. Rosa stood frozen near the counter, her eyes wide and fearful. The older agent asked to speak with her alone. I told him she would answer questions, but I would remain present as the homeowner. He hesitated, then agreed, though irritation flickered in his expression. They began by asking whether Eli had access to medical care. Rosa showed them the inhaler and the written treatment plan from the pediatric specialist I had arranged. The agent made notes without acknowledgement. Then he asked whether Eli attended school or daycare. Rosa explained he was still too young and that his asthma had made group settings difficult. Again, the agent wrote something down, his pen scratching sharply. The younger agent examined the cupboards, the refrigerator, and the bedrooms. Everything was immaculate, yet her expression suggested she was searching for something to justify suspicion. Eli clung to my hand, breathing slowly as he watched them move through the space that had only just begun to feel safe. Then came the question that shifted the entire tone. The older agent looked directly at Rosa and asked whether she was receiving money to live here. His voice was pointed, tinged with implication. Rosa blinked, stunned, and shook her head aggressively. He repeated the question, slower this time, as though trying to trap her. Her face flushed with humiliation and anger. She said no, her voice cracking. The agent asked again, asking whether she was being compensated in exchange for staying. Rosa's breathing quickened and her hands trembled. The accusations struck at every wound she carried, every stereotype forced upon her, every whisper she had endured since the tabloids made her a target. I felt heat rise in my chest, but my voice when I finally spoke was cool and precise. I told the agents that she was receiving nothing. I said I had invited her and her child to stay as my guests and that no financial arrangement existed. My tone cut through the room like a blade. The older agent looked at me, surprised by my firmness. He asked why they were living here if there was no payment. I replied that compassion did not require compensation. Then I told him that safety should not be questioned simply because a woman without wealth was living on an estate. The room fell silent. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, not of fear this time, but of relief that someone had spoken what she could not. The younger agent shifted uncomfortably and closed her clipboard. They asked a few more procedural questions, but the momentum of their intimidation had broken. When they finally left, Rosa collapsed onto a chair and covered her face. Eli crawled into her lap, holding his teddy bear. I knelt beside them and placed a hand on her shoulder. She asked why they kept coming, why strangers seemed determined to prove she was unfit, why motherhood felt like a battlefield she never enlisted in. I told her there was a reason, and that reason had roots in the same place as the rumors, the headlines, the latch on the pool gate, and the unauthorized hospital file. Someone wanted her frightened. Someone wanted her gone. Someone wanted Eli erased. She looked at me with fear and understanding intertwining. I assured her that she was not alone anymore. Later that evening, I sat in the study and reviewed the timeline. The day she arrived, a tabloid article appeared. The pool latch failed the next morning. CPS arrived within hours. Then they returned again after the second wave of online speculation. Each event aligned with precision. Each one carried a strategic purpose. I realized that this was not chaos. It was orchestration. I thought of Marcus, of his anger, his fear of public scandal, his obsession with reputation, and the fact that he had taken control of the company immediately after Evan died. The pieces began to assemble into a shape I did not want to see, yet could no longer ignore. As night settled over the estate, I walked back to the guest house. Rosa was reading to Eli, her voice soft and steady. He reached for her hand and breathed easily. I watched them through the doorway for a moment, recognizing the fragile peace they were building. When I stepped into the light, Rosa looked up, waiting for news or warning. Instead, I told her something simple and unwavering. I said that no one would take her child from her, not while I still had breath in my body. Her shoulders relaxed and she nodded, believing me because she needed to. When I returned to the main house, I understood that the storm ahead would be fierce, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. The weight of everything that had unfolded pressed against me until I could no longer carry it alone. The morning after the second CPS visit, I called Linda and asked her to return to the estate. My voice must have revealed more than I intended, because she arrived within an hour, bringing her calm, investigative presence with her. We met in the conservatory, where the light filtered through tall glass panels and the scent of thyme and basil softened the air. She sat across from me, her notebook resting on her knee, ready to hear whatever came next. For a long moment, I could not speak. My hands rested against the edge of the table, steady but tense. Then, without planning to, I confessed something I had never said aloud. I told her that I had known something was wrong from the day Evan died, but I had been too exhausted to confront it. The words felt like lifting a stone from my chest. Linda listened without interrupting. Her eyes held steady attention, neither pitying nor pressing. I continued, explaining that grief had not been the only burden I carried. For years before Evan's death, Marcus had treated him with contempt behind closed doors. He undermined him in meetings, dismissed his ideas, and mocked his compassion. Evan had been patient, believing his brother would grow out of insecurity. But the tension escalated as the company expanded. I admitted that I had witnessed arguments, harsh words, and manipulations that I chose to smooth over rather than expose. I told myself it was sibling rivalry, but deep down I knew it was something darker. I said that I remained silent to keep the family intact, to prevent scandal, to avoid choosing sides. Yet in doing so, I had abandoned the son who needed me most. Linda's expression tightened with quiet understanding. She asked whether Marcus's hostility grew after their father passed. I nodded. When my husband died, Marcus stepped into authority with eagerness that felt more like hunger. Evan tried to honor tradition and collaboration, but Marcus operated from control and pride. The company's finances faltered under his leadership, though he blamed market conditions. I confessed to Linda that when the company neared collapse, I secretly sold personal property to cover losses Marcus had caused. Family heirlooms, jewelry from my mother, art collected over decades. I liquidated them quietly through private buyers to prevent the company's downfall from becoming public. Not even the board knew. Marcus believed he had rescued the company through strategic brilliance. I allowed him to believe it. I protected his reputation at the cost of my own security. Linda leaned forward, her voice low but steady. She asked why I kept these truths hidden. I stared at the intricate tile beneath our feet and told her I was tired. After decades of keeping the family's image polished, I lacked the strength to confront internal decay. I feared that exposing Marcus would destroy the legacy my husband and I had built, and I feared losing both sons to a war between them. I said I believed I could hold the family together through silence. But silence did not hold us together. It allowed rot to grow. I told her that after Evan died, I suspected foul play, not in the sense of violence, but in the sense of pressure, stress, and betrayal that stripped him of support and safety. Yet I did nothing because grief had hollowed me out. Linda closed her notebook and looked at me with a steadiness that reminded me of a courtroom witness sworn to truth. She said that exhaustion was not the same as consent, but that silence could be interpreted as permission by those who benefited from it. Her words pierced through the fog I had lived in. I realized that Marcus had risen not because he was strong, but because I had stepped back. I asked whether she believed Marcus could have played a role in suppressing Rosa, in leaking stories to tabloids, in reporting her to CPS. She said that men like Marcus did not need to get their hands dirty. They simply suggested outcomes and let others execute them. I looked toward the window where the guest house roof was visible through the trees. I told Linda that the fear in Rosa's voice, the asthma in Eli's lungs, and the pain in the story she shared were consequences of my silence as much as Marcus's ambition. I said that I could no longer pretend that neutrality was noble. It had been cowardice wrapped in dignity. Linda placed her hand over mine, not as comfort, but as acknowledgement. She told me that truth delayed was still true, and that there was time to set things right if I chose to act rather than observe. Her words settled into me with clarity. For the first time since Evan's death, I felt my spine straighten with something other than grief. I understood that uncovering the truth would mean exposing my own failures as well as Marcus's actions. I understood that protecting Rosa and Eli would require confrontation rather than retreat. I also understood that love sometimes demands reckoning. When Linda left, I remained seated in the conservatory, listening to the soft hum of the heater and the distant sound of Eli laughing in the garden. The sound struck me as both fragile and hopeful. I breathed deeply and accepted what lay ahead. I would no longer be silent. The resolve I found in the conservatory carried me through the next day, though my thoughts were sharp and restless. I spent the morning with Eli while Rosa rested. His breathing had steadied, and he seemed lighter, playing on the rug with his crayons and the caramel-colored teddy bear that never left his side. I watched him closely, not only with affection, but with a sense that the bear itself held a thread connecting past and present. The toy had appeared at the cemetery. It matched the one I had given Evan as a boy. The stitching was the same uneven repair I had made one summer night when the ear tore. I asked Eli if I could see it, and he nodded, handing it to me with trust that warmed my chest. I turned it gently in my hands, letting memory guide my fingers. The fur was worn, and the stuffing had shifted with years of being held. But something caught my attention. Behind the left ear, the seam looked newer than the rest. The thread was slightly darker, tighter, and more deliberate than my old repair. My pulse quickened. I asked Eli whether anyone had fixed the bear recently. He shook his head, saying it had always been like that. I asked Rosa quietly, and she said Evan had given it to her when she told him she was pregnant. She said he had said it was important to him. My throat tightened. I asked whether she had ever opened it. She looked confused and said no. I held the bear again, feeling along the seam. There was a small knot, precise and purposeful. With careful fingers, I loosened the thread. The seam parted just enough for me to feel something beneath the fabric. A small piece of folded paper rested inside, tucked deep into the stuffing. I slid it out slowly, afraid it would crumble. Rosa watched with wide eyes, her breath catching. Eli leaned closer, his curiosity intense. The paper was creased and thin, but the ink was still legible. It contained a string of numbers and letters, written in Evan's handwriting. Not a message, a password. A chill ran through me. Evan had always kept digital records of his projects and research. He believed transparency and evidence mattered. He once told me that if he ever needed to protect something, he would hide access in a place no one would suspect. I looked at Rosa, and she covered her mouth, realizing the magnitude of what we held. I folded the paper again and placed it safely in my pocket. Then I asked whether Evan had left anything with her besides the bear. She hesitated, then led me to a drawer in the bedroom. Inside was a small metal USB drive wrapped in cloth. She said he had given it to her the night before he died, telling her to keep it safe and never open it unless something happened. He never returned to explain. I held the drive in my hand, feeling its cool surface. The weight of it was small, yet the meaning was immense. This was the proof he never had the chance to reveal. The evidence, he said, would expose wrongdoing within the family, the link between his death, Marcus's rise, and the fear that had haunted Rosa. I told her we needed to access it, but carefully. If the information it contained was as sensitive as Evan hinted, it could trigger consequences we were not prepared for. Rosa nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Eli tugged on her sleeve, sensing the tension, and she pulled him close. I reassured him with a smile, though inside I felt the tremor of approaching truth. I left the guest house and walked to my private study, the only room Marcus never entered. I powered on the old laptop I used before the company adopted synchronized accounts. Its isolation meant privacy. I entered the password from the paper. The system accepted it immediately and opened a hidden folder labeled with a date just 1 week before Evan died. Inside were financial records, internal emails, board meeting transcripts, and flagged transactions routed through offshore accounts. The files outlined a pattern of embezzlement masked as restructuring. The trail of signatures and authorizations pointed unmistakably to Marcus. My stomach knotted. Then I opened the final document. It was a recorded audio file. Evan's voice filled the room, steady but strained. He said he had discovered the theft and was preparing to present it to the board. He said he feared someone would try to stop him. He said if the recording was being heard, it meant he had not been able to deliver the truth himself. He ended with a single warning: do not trust Marcus. I sat back in my chair, tears welling, not from grief alone, but from the unbearable confirmation that my son had died, carrying a truth he could not reveal. I remembered Rose's story, the pressure he had been under, the fear that had etched itself into his final hours. I remembered the cold politeness Marcus adopted, the speed with which he stepped into control, the calculated removal of anything that threatened him. I realized that silence had allowed betrayal to flourish. I wiped my face and closed the laptop. The weight of what I now held was heavy, but it was also clarifying. I understood that the path forward was no longer about suspicion or fear. It was about action. When I returned to the guest house, Rosa searched my eyes for an answer. I told her we had what Evan wanted us to find. Her shoulders sagged with relief and apprehension. Eli reached for my hand, placing the bear in my palm as though entrusting me with more than a toy. I held it gently, grateful for the small stitched seam that had carried a secret across years of loss. As night settled over the estate, I knew the time for quiet endurance had ended. The truth was finally awake, and so was I. The decision to bring the truth into the light led me to request a formal board meeting at the company headquarters. The boardroom had always been a symbol of legacy and power, with its long polished table, leather chairs, and portraits of previous leaders watching from the walls. I had sat at that table countless times beside my husband and later beside Evan. Returning there now felt like stepping onto a stage where history would either correct itself or repeat its failures. I arrived early, taking my seat at the head of the table, a place I had not occupied since Evan's death. One by one, the board members entered, offering polite greetings tinged with curiosity. Marcus arrived last, his expression tight with irritation and confusion. He asked why a meeting had been called without his authorization. I told him the bylaws allowed a founding family member to request one. He sat across from me, jaw clenched. When the meeting began, Marcus launched into a presentation he claimed was urgent. He spoke about projections, expansion strategies, and investor confidence. His voice was smooth, confident, and practiced. The board listened politely, though I saw unease in a few eyes. When he finished, I thanked him and then stood slowly. I told the board that I had information they needed to hear. Marcus laughed lightly, trying to disguise nerves with arrogance. He asked whether this was about the girl and the child. His tone suggested scandal rather than truth. I did not answer him. Instead, I placed a folder on the table. I said the company had been the victim of embezzlement. A murmur rippled through the room. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He said such an accusation was reckless and unfounded. He said the financial audit had cleared all executives. I looked at him without blinking and opened the folder, showing copies of the records from the hidden files. I pointed to the signatures authorizing the transfers, the shell accounts, the timestamps. The room stilled. Marcus stood and accused me of fabricating evidence. He said grief had clouded my judgment. He said I was being manipulated by outsiders. His voice rose, sharp and brittle. I remained seated, hands folded, my breathing steady. He demanded to know where I obtained the documents. I told him that the truth had been protected by someone he never expected. His face paled. He asked whether I was suggesting he had benefited from his brother's death. I did not respond. Silence unsettled him more than accusation. The board watched us closely, sensing a fracture they could no longer ignore. Then I reached into my bag and placed a small device on the table. I pressed a button, and Evan's voice filled the room. The sound was clear, steady, and devastating. He said that if anything happened to him, it was not an accident. He said he had uncovered theft within the company and was preparing to reveal it. He said he feared someone would stop him. His voice carried the weight of truth, of warning, of a life cut short. When the recording ended, the room fell into complete silence. Not a chair moved. Not a breath sounded. Marcus's face was drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The board members looked at him with shock, suspicion, and dawning realization. The weight of proof did what argument never could. I stood, letting the silence settle. I did not defend, explain, or accuse. I simply gathered the folder and the device. Then I looked at Marcus and said nothing. The absence of words spoke louder than any confrontation. The board chair cleared his throat and said the company would conduct an immediate independent investigation. He said Marcus would be placed on temporary leave. Marcus protested, but his voice sounded small against the echo of Evan's words. I walked toward the door, feeling decades of silence lift from my shoulders. As I reached the hallway, I heard the board begin to discuss succession, stability, and reputation. But this time, the narrative did not belong to Marcus. It belonged to the truth. In the elevator, I closed my eyes and let the quiet surround me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from release. When I stepped out into the lobby, the receptionist looked at me with newfound respect, as though sensing a shift she could not name. Outside, the air was crisp, and the sunlight broke through the clouds. I felt the warmth on my face, and for the first time since Evan's death, breathing came easily. I returned to the estate where Rosa and Eli waited in the garden. They looked up when I approached, searching my face for answers. I knelt beside them and told them we were no longer living in the shadow of secrets. Rosa exhaled, her shoulders lowering. Eli placed his small hand in mine, trusting without knowing why. That night, as the house settled into quiet, I stood at the window and looked toward the guest house. A soft lamp glowed inside. I thought of Evan, of the laughter he once carried, of the burden he died holding, and of the truth that had finally been heard. I whispered a promise to him, one carried not by guilt, but by love. The silence surrounding me no longer felt like absence. It felt like justice was beginning to rise. The consequences of the boardroom meeting unfolded faster than even I expected. By the next morning, the board convened without Marcus present and voted unanimously to remove him from all executive authority. The announcement was delivered in a formal letter hand-delivered to the estate by a company courier. I read it once, then again, letting the reality settle into my bones. The power Marcus had gripped so tightly was gone. His nameplate would be removed, his access codes would be revoked. His influence, once unquestioned, was now suspended pending full investigation. Legal counsel began preparing inquiries, and auditors were assigned to review every financial trail. The company that had once been his shield had become the instrument of his reckoning. When Marcus learned of the decision, he stormed into the mansion with a fury I had not seen since he was a child, and denied something he believed he deserved. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp and rapid. He found me in the sitting room arranging fresh flowers. His face was reddened, his breath uneven. He demanded to know how the board could have turned against him. I kept my gaze on the vase, adjusting a lily stem before answering. I said the board acted on evidence. He accused me of betrayal. He said I had humiliated him. He said I had sided with strangers. I finally turned to look at him, seeing not a powerful man, but a frightened one, desperate to preserve an identity built on control rather than integrity. He followed me into the hallway as I walked toward the garden. His voice rose, asking whether I understood what I had done. He said investors would panic. He said the press would speculate. He said the family legacy would crumble. I stepped outside into the cool air, letting the door swing open behind me. He continued after me, words tumbling out like accusations flung in every direction. Then his voice cracked with a different kind of pain. He asked whether I chose them over him. The words hung in the air, weighted with childhood resentment, adult entitlement, and a wounded pride that had never learned humility. I turned to face him fully, the garden quiet around us, the guest house visible in the distance. I told him I chose the truth. The answer was simple, but it struck him harder than any argument ever could. He stared at me, stunned. His mouth opened as though to speak, but no words formed. The silence between us stretched, not empty, but full of every moment I had let him believe that power was his birthright and accountability was optional. His shoulders sank slightly, and for the first time he looked small. I turned away and walked toward the path without looking back. The gravel crunched beneath my steps, steady and deliberate. I did not wait for him to follow. As I approached the guest house, I saw Rosa through the window reading to Eli. The soft glow inside contrasted with the tension that still pulsed behind me. I remained outside for a moment, breathing in the scent of the garden, listening to the distant hum of the estate. My heart felt heavy, yet anchored. When I entered, Rosa looked up, searching my expression. I told her that Marcus had been removed from the company. Relief washed across her features, mixed with disbelief. She asked whether that meant the danger was gone. I told her the investigation had only begun and that truth often stirs turbulence before peace. Eli climbed into my lap with his teddy bear, resting his head against me. His small warmth grounded me in a way nothing else could. That evening, the estate felt different. The staff moved quietly, sensing a shift in authority. No one asked questions, but their eyes told me they understood something unseen had changed. I went to my husband's portrait in the library and looked at his familiar, steady gaze. I whispered that legacy without integrity was emptiness. The room held the confession without judgment. When I returned to my quarters, I found that sleep did not come easily. My mind replayed Marcus's face, the shock, the disbelief, the crumbling certainty. I wondered whether he would ever understand the depth of the harm he caused, not only to the company, but to the memory of the brother he overshadowed. The next morning, legal representatives contacted me to confirm that formal proceedings were underway. They asked whether I wished to make a statement. I declined. The evidence spoke for itself. I spent the day with Rosa and Eli, baking bread, tending the garden, and allowing normal moments to rebuild what fear had stripped away. Harvey stopped by and offered a gentle nod, as though acknowledging a balance restored. As the sun set, painting the estate in warm gold, I sat on the porch and listened to Eli laughing. The sound eased something inside me, soothing a place that had ached for too long. Marcus did not return to the estate that night. The mansion felt lighter without his presence, as though the walls themselves exhaled. I knew the days ahead would bring scrutiny, noise, and unresolved emotions, but I also knew that the silence I carried for years had finally been broken. Truth had taken its place, steady and unshaken. When I closed my eyes, I felt Evan's presence, not in sorrow, but in affirmation. The path forward was no longer one of endurance. It was one of restoration. 2 years passed, and the estate felt transformed in ways that could not be measured by architecture or wealth, but by breath, by warmth, and by the quiet restoration of what had once been fractured. The investigation concluded, and the company stabilized under new leadership committed to transparency. Rosa completed her architectural degree and began designing community homes centered around dignity. Eli grew taller, stronger, and freer. His asthma eased with proper care and open air. As for me, I found myself living not in the shadow of legacy, but in the blossoming of something gentler. Healing did not arrive all at once. It came in seasons, like the roses that return to bloom after harsh winters. On a warm afternoon, I stood in the backyard garden, where sunlight filtered through the leaves in a soft, golden haze. The grass beneath my feet released the scent of earth and fresh growth. The breeze carried hints of lavender and rosemary from the planters Rosa and I tended together. Birds perched along the fence line, chirping with an ease that made the world feel newly made. The garden had become the heart of the estate, not the boardroom, not the marble foyer. Here, life moved slowly, honestly, and without pretense. I bent to prune a cluster of herbs when I heard the sound of small footsteps running across the path. Then a bright voice called out to me, "Grandma D." The name warmed me every time I heard it. I turned, and there was Eli, his hair sunlit, his smile wide, his eyes full of the same spark Evan once carried. He rushed toward me, wrapping his hands around mine, his palms warm and soft against my skin. The feeling grounded me. The afternoon slowed, expanding into one of those rare moments where time itself seemed willing to pause. I felt the warmth of his touch, the gentle squeeze of his fingers, and the trust contained within the gesture. I breathed in the scent of grass, sun-warmed wood, and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. He asked if we could water the plants together. I nodded, and he picked up the small watering can that fit perfectly in his hands. I guided him to the newest section of the garden, where young shoots reached toward the light. As we poured water over the soil, he asked questions about roots and growth and how plants know which way is up. His curiosity reminded me that life continues, even after it has been interrupted by loss. I told him that roots grow deeper when they are nurtured, and he smiled as though he understood something larger than the words. As we worked, my mind drifted to the past. I thought of the silence that once smothered me. I thought of the heavy grief that made me small. I thought of Evan, of the laughter he carried and the burden he died holding. I thought of Marcus, of his ambition and his downfall. And I thought of myself, of the years I spent believing that endurance was strength. I looked at the sunlight shining across Eli's face and felt a truth rise in me with clarity. I had lost one son because I stayed silent. I would never let silence rule me again. The words formed softly within me. I lost a child to silence. I will never be silent again. Eli tugged my sleeve and pointed to the wooden sign at the edge of the garden. Together we walked toward it. The sign was simple, handcrafted by Rosa, etched with care, and mounted beside a bed of blooming flowers. It read, "Evan's Garden, where new roots grow." I stood there, letting the words settle into me. They were not an epitaph. They were a promise, a continuation, a quiet declaration that healing did not erase loss, but wove it into something living. Rosa stepped onto the path, carrying a basket of fresh bread. She smiled, her eyes peaceful in a way I once wondered if she would ever know. She thanked me, not with words, but with presence, with stability, with the life she built for her son. I felt no superiority in offering them a home. Instead, I felt gratitude for the way they restored purpose to mine. We sat together at the garden table, sharing bread, sunlight, and a stillness that felt earned. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the sky shifted into soft shades of peach and lavender. Eli chased fireflies across the grass, laughing with a freedom that echoed like music. I watched him, knowing that he carried pieces of Evan into a future untouched by deceit. I closed my eyes and felt the warmth of the fading sun against my skin, the air cool and gentle, the scent of flowers lifting toward twilight. I whispered a quiet message to the son I lost, telling him that his child was safe, that truth had prevailed, and that love had taken root in places once barren. Later, as I stood to water the last corner of the garden, I looked once more at the wooden sign. My heart felt steady. My voice, internal but unmistakable, spoke with conviction. I will never be silent again. The watering can emptied into the soil, nourishing the young plants that would bloom long after I was gone. And now, as I share this story with you, I invite you into the reflection that lingers. If you were in my place, would you forgive? Marcus, would you carry anger or would you release it? Would you choose justice or peace or both? I would love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to comment, to share where you are listening from, and to join our community of stories that heal, strengthen, and remind us that it is never too late to begin again.